I have seen people who are hyper successful, who have really difficult backgrounds or areas that they've kind of triumphed over through really channeling themselves into their work. And so even like this lack of balance can sometimes indicate that there's something awry in the system, whether that be complete isolation or someone who completely throws themselves into their work, and is incredibly good at tracking every single thing around them, which is a real asset in a work environment potentially. But what they discover for a lot of the clients that we've worked with at the Manor is there's no off switch. So whatever that high functioning, hyper functioning mode is, you can never turn it off. And that's why a lot of the folks that we work with rely on substances to downregulate, because they cannot do it themselves. It's just
Yeah,
not an option.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like one is restricting the range of what their repertoires in life can be. It's really kind of loaded into one sort of zone, whether it's hyper functioning in some domain. What does that provide? It provides predictability, which is often, unpredictability is often, and uncertainty is often threatening to anyone with trauma. Control, and that, is kind of connected to that. And yeah, it limits the amount of unforeseen sort of, threatening experiences, whether it's basic, just interpersonal things like intimacy, or something literally more life-threatening, depending on the trauma.
I would also add to that most of the clients that we see here are not able or are unwilling to ask for help. So it's usually a good indication that somebody has trauma in their background if they're coming in a crisis, whether it's almost dying, or the family's leaving them, or they've lost their job, and it took that much for them to actually say, white flag, I need help, things aren't okay. Since COVID, we've seen that, I think, for me, at least, and us here, like, people that are coming in here, I don't think have ever been sicker, and yet they're still drinking, even though they're literally, their body is giving out, and yet they're still not asking for help. And for me, especially among successful professionals that are driven, a lot of times most men and women will say, if I ask for help, it's a weakness, there's something wrong with me. And so their drive to succeed is to overcompensate this weakness around, I'm really not okay, I'm really weak, I'm really hurting.
Yeah, they can't ask for help until that very last domain has fallen, and that capacity, or that muscle is so well exercised that you can a person can rationalize, no, well, this area of my life is still intact, is still functioning, and look, I'm succeeding, or not going backwards. And so I just need to figure these other parts out. But they've so overcompensated with one area, the other parts have been kind of damaged or neglected long term, that they don't even recognize that the problem exists. And that's often why it's other people around them that lead them into treatment, push, pull, cajole, whatever the case may be, that people move into that space of finally letting down, and being willing to recognize, okay, this has been terribly out of balance for a long period of time. Maybe I can do something about it.
I love what you're saying. I want to kind of consolidate a couple pieces of that. I think our culture does not value and emphasize the importance of balance. I think it values and prizes success and financial viability. So we have a culture that reinforces working as and overworking as a badge of honor. I saw a post on this that I thought was like really profound, is this idea that if you're doing really well and you're successful, you've always got tons of things going on. So I think insidiously, people who really struggle asking for help, or knowing how to take care of themselves, Maybe they might come from environments where they were forced to be an adult prematurely and they've relied on themselves for so long and they felt like that was a value they really appreciated, is their own self-reliance. And so you get them into the business world and they prosper tremendously because they're resourceful in figuring out how to make things happen, and they will work until they're successful. I think that's, and then this piece of, if you can do the job of 3 people, you're prized in an organization, right? And so then they get further reinforced in the system as being kind of hyper functioners. And yet they have children at home that say, I don't know who my parent is. Or they have a partner at home that 30 years later says, you know what, I'm ready for a divorce because I don't feel like I'm actually married to you. I feel like I don't even know who you are as a person.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I even think it's like when people are practicing overriding for so long and it becomes so normalized, at one point they can even be like, I don't know who I am anymore.
Mhm.
It can even be internal too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just to pull back a little bit on kind of the different definitions of trauma, right? I know that a lot of people will understand like a plane crash to be a traumatic experience, right? Being in a car accident could be considered, being assaulted could be considered a traumatic experience. Going to war could be a traumatic experience. In our practices, I think the number of people that we see that meet full threshold criteria for PTSD, and that's where someone felt their life was in danger and kind of that abject helplessness, that led to this cascade of symptoms. There's not a lot of people that I've seen that are full criteria PTSD people, and yet we have all these people with more subtle but incredibly insidious trauma-related symptoms. And so I guess one way to think about it is these big T traumas, these traumas that everybody would agree, for looking outside in, oh, that would be a traumatic experience. Does anyone want to talk more about the more subtle versions of trauma that can be just as pervasively disruptive in terms of, managing life and relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I pulled up. So there is a Kaiser Permanente did a study on adverse childhood experiences. And the study was measuring the amount of adverse childhood experiences and then creating a connection to physical and emotional illnesses that will most likely occur the higher the ACEs are. So I'm just bringing up the ACEs because it's a really good example of the big T traumas, which we think about for PTSD, and the small T traumas. So with the ACEs, there's 3 categories. One is abuse, and I think we would all consider that to be a big T trauma, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual. The second one that I think it is not an overt, but it's a covert trauma, is neglect. So emotional or physical neglect. So a lot of us, when we think about neglect, we think about scarcity, lack of finances, and physical neglect. We mainly see here emotional neglect. And then the third category is household dysfunction, and I feel like these are the ones that most people would not think about, and when we think about trauma. So there's mental illness within the family, a mother in the family being treated violently, that could be emotionally or physically, divorce. How many of us come from divorce, right? I mean, most people on the ACEs check yes. Unfortunately, that is the reality of our culture. When my daughter was in first grade, she came home and asked where her second father was because all of her friends around her had 2 parents, 2 sets of parents. Incarcerated relative, and finally substance abuse. So the first 2 categories, especially the first one, there's a physical mark. You're talking about sexual abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse. And the last ones to me are like, well, a lot of people come from scarcity. A lot of people have divorced parents. A lot of people have substance abuse rampant in their family dynamics, or mental illness. And mothers treated violently, like that to me is, a lot of people can say, well, yeah, of course, through the divorce, there was emotional abuse with my mom. So to me, I like those three definitions because it's easy to look at, and understanding that it doesn't have to be the big T. It can be small t, which is more chronic states of a traumatic experience where your nervous system is dysregulated for long periods of time. Small t trauma.
I even think about just regular, any one of us who has maybe work stress, has kids at home that need attention, maybe the parents are sick, COVID. It's this like compilation of all these stresses where our nervous system doesn't get a chance, like you said, Chris, finding its way back to homeostasis. And in this like constant push towards charge in the system, or excitation, not even necessarily happy excitation, but consistent charge in the system, where our system doesn't get a chance to find its way back down, causes a dysregulated nervous system. So that's why I think some people are baffled at like, why am I not sleeping well? Why am I losing control of my emotions? Why am I so short with everybody? Why don't I know myself anymore? Because it just can sneak up without us realizing it, because in the context of our culture, like we said earlier, overriding our state is so normalized. So we're not even facing it ourselves, and all of a sudden it's just like spirals out of control. So I think it can be really surprising for people.
Can one of you speak about what types of environmental circumstances are likely to trigger a worsening for people that you've worked with? Like, what would be the circumstances that would tend to destabilize people who maybe have some sort of trauma in their background? I mean, I can say one is COVID.
Yeah, and you say that, I'm like, anything.
Yeah.
I feel like if my capacity is so small, it could be getting a flat tire, and suddenly I'm like, I don't even know what to do in life. It could be anything.
Right. So I go ahead, Pam.
I mean, there's anything that's big that's out of our control. Who's being elected? When are we getting our shots? Are we going to get sick with it? What if the person we don't like is being elected? I mean, this year is a perfect example where most of us felt completely out of control.
Yes.
And if we have a history of trauma, we usually try to control all aspects that we possibly can to feel safe. And 2020 was the exact opposite of control for most people. So, and then I feel like if we're not control on a larger, like if on a larger scale, if we can't control that, and then like what Tammy said, then all of a sudden something on a smaller scale, or something that normally should go right, getting sick, or having again, your car breaks down or something, your ability to tolerate anything that's normally small becomes almost impossible because you're so wrapped up in everything that's big.
Yep, great point. So the lack of uncertainty, lack of predictability, inability to control an outcome, right? I mean, I know those are big things that I see set folks off, myself included. So why don't we just so obviously if you see someone in your environment that looks like they're struggling, right? This quickness to anger, hyper irritability, being moved to tears very spontaneously without really, the situation doesn't really call for it. We would encourage people to just try and talk with someone and say, I can see that that there's a lot happening for you, and I wonder if there's anything that I can do to be helpful for you. I think it's a little tricky. I would encourage people to go cautiously with that, because oftentimes when people are feeling really vulnerable and exposed, someone else commenting on noticing something is not right can often make people more reactive and more shut down and defensive. And so I think the one thing that I would say is really evaluate the quality of the relationship you have with that person. And if you don't think that you have a close enough relationship to have that conversation, I would approach someone who does, because I think The safety of the connection is a big thing that matters in terms of someone's receptivity to talking about things. Would you guys add other things to that in terms of how to support someone that you get the sense that there might be something going on?
I love that. And one thing that I think about adding too is being regulated and centered. I'm avoiding using the word calm because I think we can often be like, oh, I'm totally calm, and inside I'm like, ah. But being centered and feeling pretty much in somewhat control of your own internal environment, and just being near them. If the relationship calls for it, hand on the shoulder, no words need to be spoken, and that can be one of the best interventions out there. Just that co-regulation, nervous system to nervous system, can be really impactful.
After you've sanitized your hands, of course.
Of course, and you're wearing a mask and everything's
But what you just said is so perfect, right? Because of course,
right.
Our opportunities for co-regulation have dramatically disappeared in the context of COVID, right? Even
good
what
point.
we use to self-soothe? Touch. We use physical proximity. We use facial cues as a way to regulate. And all of those things have been literally eliminated in the context of what has happened for people. So I don't know, other reactions and thoughts to that?
I think the worst thing you can tell somebody is they should feel or think differently about whatever they're feeling and thinking. So attunement to me is to show up with wherever the person is at without judgment or without your reaction. And if you begin to judge or react out of your own dysregulation to wherever they're at, it's going to shut them down immediately.
So go ahead, Dr. Cameron.
I was just going to say, so that idea of giving unsolicited advice probably isn't a good idea, right? If you're asking them if they're okay or if they need to talk, right? So one is actually kind of meaning that, and then preparing yourself to receive more than no, I'm fine, right? Which is our kind of usual default. Oh, are you doing okay? I can see you're not. And then you don't actually have the space or capacity to hold if the person is in a place and they're willing to share. And then the other thing is to not feel compelled that when you have heard it or are hearing it, to try and fix it in that moment, but giving space and permission for people to share what's going on and not feeling that you need to fix it, or that, frankly, that you can fix it in that moment.
Does anyone want to comment on a particular resource-based trauma therapy that they're aware of or familiar with, and what that means in the context of getting treatment?
I can comment on EMDR. So EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, is an actual form of exposure therapy that does use exposure to the incidents that occurred that traumatized you. However, it also uses, and if you don't have resources to help you experience or re-experience the incident in a safe way, through the use of EMDR, I mean, it's a very complicated, it's a complicated therapy, so I'm trying to do my best to be simple about it. But the client is asked to bring up the traumatic memory and the feelings and the emotions and the somatic experiences of that memory. And basically, through the use of eye movements, they're able to actually have a disruption in the experience of that trauma. So we used to think that it's using REM state and in a REM sleep, eye movement in an awake state. We used to think that we're accessing the right and the left brain, but now what the research is showing, it's actually disrupting the experience of the trauma. So as you're feeling overwhelmed by it, if you ask somebody to move their eyes right to the left, they experience relief immediately because you're disrupting that process. And then we add resources And a resource to me is allowing the person to feel safe in that old experience. For example, having somebody feel like you're not there now, that was old, you're currently in control, you're not dying, and you can install that emotionally, you can install that physiologically and cognitively. So it's bringing up the traumatic event, it's disrupting your experience of it, and then it's adding safe resources to bring you back into the present and allow yourself to feel like that was old, but I'm here now and I'm okay.
So the medium of somatic experiencing is nervous system as well. I think most trauma therapies are. And the goal of it is to just help remind the nervous system how to regulate itself. And we look at any sort of traumatic event, whether it's a series of small T traumas or a big T trauma, as, like I said earlier, the nervous system almost forgetting how to go through these cycles of activation and settling, activation and settling. And so I'll always start every session, as much as I can, giving clients this infusion of safety cues, because once we're dysregulated, whether it's conscious or unconscious, there's this message of threat, 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 not safe, not safe, not safe. So giving people any here and now cues of safety, whether it's noticing the floor underneath you, hearing the sounds in the room that are usually like my voice or soft music or the wind blowing outside, and all of these sensory awarenesses that help people kind of ground in the moment, which is teasing forward the parasympathetic nervous system first. And once that's online, even a little bit more than it was before, then we have this opportunity, what we call titration. So just, and it's a term taken from chemistry, like small little droplets of charge into a system that has a little bit greater capacity. So the system has a chance of first kind of finding a little bit of homeostasis, having the tiniest bit of charge, and putting it under a microscope. And what I mean by that is the language that we work with the nervous system is felt sense. So people start noticing, oh, calm feels like a sense of heaviness or a sense of lightness, or my eyes feel more relaxed, or my arms don't feel so tense, or it's just whatever it is for that person. So they start to get a little bit more associated with the conversation that their body is always having with them. And once that little droplet of stress comes into the system, we put that under a microscope, and it's all they need to feel is just the beginning. And for people who are very dysregulated, just that tiny droplet can send them in the direction of too much too fast. So then it's redirecting their attention back towards that state of homeostasis that they felt 2 seconds ago. And then that little piece of that little droplet of stress gets integrated into the wholeness again. And expounding on that a little bit more, another droplet of stress, and it becomes a little bit more digestible. And over time, the nervous system can do this dance of expansion and contraction a lot more easily. And in doing so, it's so beautiful because literally their capacity for experience increases over time. And usually by the end of the session, people are just kind of walking out with more confidence than they knew they had, or a sense of peace that they haven't felt since they were 3 years old, or whatever the story is. So it's really using felt sense to help establish a sense of safety, security, and ability, which is, I think, the most interesting and cool thing.